Hi everyone, Joey D'Anna here, and this is a pretty exciting insight because I have with me the beta version of DaVinci Resolve for the M1 and M2 iPad Pro. And this surprised a lot of people, I think, when Blackmagic first announced it, but it didn't surprise me because with Apple transitioning to their new ARM-based architecture, which the iPad M1 and M2 is based off of, and all of their mobile platforms are based off of, and all the new Macs are based off of, it was only a matter of time before really powerhouse desktop applications were able to make their way onto these portable devices because the software is actually the same. You can compile and run the same code on the iPad as you can on a Mac desktop. And the GPUs and CPUs that these portable devices are shipping with these days are really, really powerful, especially when you consider the fact that the M1 and the M2 chips have things like ProRes and H.264 and H.265 encode and decode, hardware accelerated right off the chip. There's less work for the GPU to do, allowing it to run really well on something like an iPad. So in this insight, I want to talk about what DaVinci Resolve for iPad is, what it isn't, some of the limitations, some of the really cool advantages, and some workflows that I think it's going to be really ideally suited for. Now, when you first open up DaVinci Resolve for iPad, you'll notice it looks really familiar. That's because the project manager window is basically the same. In fact, all of it is the same with just some interface tweaks to make it more friendly on a touch interface like the iPad to be optimized for this platform. That means you can connect to local disk databases stored on the iPad, network SQL databases on your local network, or, most importantly, the Blackmagic cloud database if you're connected to the internet. This, I think, is kind of the killer feature of DaVinci Resolve for iPad because, again, it's the same code base. The projects are completely compatible. This means I can see all of my projects on the cloud, and as long as I have media available to the iPad, it could be proxies, it could be transcodes, or it could be full copies of the original media, I can use the cloud database and even cloud collaboration simultaneously with desktop and additional iPad clients. So that kind of brings up a big question. What about storage? How do you get media to work with onto your iPad? Well, essentially, anything that you can access in the Files app on your iPad, you can access in DaVinci Resolve, but this doesn't mean that it will be an optimal experience for all things, because the Files app basically combines different storage sources available to the iPad and puts them all together in one interface, but they're not all the same. For example, if I open up a cloud service like Dropbox or Google Drive or OneDrive, the Files app will show the files available in those services. And if I go into DaVinci Resolve and try to import media, I can see those files and folders from the cloud services right in the Files dialog. But the problem is, all of those files are just placeholders. They live in the cloud and aren't pulled down to the device until they're accessed. If you have it in your Files app, but it isn't cached for local access from the cloud provider, DaVinci Resolve will sit there waiting for the cloud provider to download the file before you can access it, which isn't ideal. And that's not really DaVinci's fault. That is just a function of how the file management on iPad OS works. So if you do want to use files that are synced to a cloud service, what you want to do is go into that cloud service's iPad app, find the files you want, and make sure Make Available Offline is turned on for them. Now you can see it's downloading the file locally to the iPad, and if I navigate to that file now, you can see it doesn't have a little cloud download icon associated with it. And I can select the file and drop it right into Resolve and start working with it. So to make the best use of Resolve on the iPad, there's a couple of additional things that I think you should get. They're not required, but they make the experience a lot better. Those are the Apple Pencil, because it makes navigating around the touch interface really precise, almost like you had a tablet that you were clicking on things with. The Apple keyboard case cover magnetic thing that the iPad docks into, because all of the default DaVinci Resolve shortcuts are available here and work from the keyboard. And finally, a USB-C SSD or card reader or whatever you need to access your media on an external device. This is new for the newer generation of iPads. You can plug in external storage and it works at full USB 3 or Thunderbolt speed. So if you have a fast SSD with a bunch of media on it, it's a great way to get going in Resolve quickly. And if you need to take a project on the road, you can just consolidate that media to your little SSD and bring it with you. It's really easy to just plug in and use. So let's talk a little bit about what Resolve for the iPad is and it isn't. It is not the full Resolve interface, but it is the full Resolve software. What this means is the backend playback engine in Resolve for iPad is the same as it is on the desktop. So if you open up a project and you have all the media and you have things like fusion effects or Fairlight effects or really complicated color grades, it will open and play back, and it will read all of those things. There's nothing limiting what it can read from a Resolve project, but they've only exposed certain pages and certain controls to the iPad version because, quite frankly, not all of the pages in Resolve are ever going to be touch-friendly. Blackmagic has said that they don't want to bring the edit page over to the iPad because they don't want to break the existing excellent functionality of the edit page to make it touch-friendly. So instead, they've said that they're going to add more editorial features and audio features to the cut page, which, as you'll see, is very touch-friendly and very Apple Pencil-friendly as well. So let's look at the interface, and there's a couple of user interface things that you should be aware of. First, there is no drop-down menu for file, media, timeline, etc. All of those functions that are relevant to what's available on the iPad are going to be in the user interface. So you'll see a couple of user interface changes that reflect that. Also, the project settings is slightly different for the iPad. You still have your normal master setting, resolution, image scaling, color management, everything else, but under general options is where you'll find your caching options. This is really important because while the M1s and M2s are impressively fast for an iPad, you're probably going to do some grades or some operations that are going to need to cache. And without that drop-down menu, this is where you would turn on either your Smart Cache or your User Cache. And by default, it just saves to a DaVinci Resolve folder on your iPad. Another user interface thing, to right-click, just tap and hold. And you'll notice the menus are a little bit wider spaced to make using touch or pen input a lot easier. And if you have the trackpad on the optional keyboard, you can right-click by doing a 2-finger click, and that works really well, just like it does on the desktop. Over on the color page, things look really familiar with a couple of minor changes to accommodate the touch interface. For example, your clip timeline down here is now split between clips and timeline to save some vertical real estate. You can just jump between the two with a tap. Also, operations like adding and managing nodes, again, we don't have the main drop-down menu, so you can either do that with the keyboard, just like you were on the desktop, or you'll notice there's now add serial node buttons, add parallel node buttons, or add layer mixer node buttons. And in the 3-dot menu, you can also add an alpha output or add a key mixer node for combining different mats. Now, by default, the click and drag behavior is to draw a lasso, just like it is on the desktop. But if you switch over to the hand tool, we can actually drag the node tree around. And what's really cool about this is even if you're in the hand tool, and by the way, pinch zoom also works, if you're in the hand tool, you can still click on individual nodes. It's just defining the behavior when you click and drag in the blank space. As opposed to 3 bottom panels on the desktop, you get 2 here, either the keyframe or your scopes, and all of your color tools are available here on the left. You'll notice the camera raw tab has a little drop down in the corner. That's because not all the tabs fit right here. If we click and hold, color match, motion effects, and RGB mixer is available. And certain things like the color warper and curves are honestly really nice on the iPad with the pen, especially curves. See, if I open up the big curves, I can draw right on here with the pen. I can open up the 3-dot menu, enable splines, and get really close and do some really precision work with these curves, which is really nice. Same thing with power windows. If I add a circular power window, and I'm just going to hit Shift F to go full screen, look, I can navigate this power window just with the pen on the screen and move it around interactively. And while I'm doing that, I can pinch zoom the viewer. And if I hold 2 fingers on the viewer, I can pan the viewer around. So I'm going to kind of just move this and zoom and pan, and you can see we can really interactively position and animate power windows. And if you're doing any kind of frame-by-frame roto work, that's really useful. And that quick jump in and out of the full screen viewer is one of the reasons why I really think having the keyboard is worth having, because things like the zoom in and zoom out keys work, Shift Z to default your viewer works, again, all of your node creation works. Anything that is mapped on the color page by default is available with the iPad keyboard. The gallery and LUT pages are available, and they take your power grades from your database. So if you have grades saved, you can load those grades right into your project on the iPad. And as you can see here, my default node tree is just a little too big for the iPad screen, even with the LUT window closed. So for those cases, you can move around the size of the viewer a little bit, but even if that doesn't give you enough space, there is a zoom to fit button up here in the top right. And when you click that, you see it's scaled down all of the nodes to nicely fit in the iPad user interface. This is really good to have if you've built complex node trees and you don't want to adjust your workflow just to be able to access them on the iPad. So let's talk about performance. When I first opened this up, I was really surprised because I expected it to be pretty good. I didn't expect it to be slow or laggy or have problems, but I didn't expect it to be as fast as it is. This is the M1 iPad, so not even the most advanced CPU you can get in an iPad. And if I start doing some grades, right now I've got this project set to HD, and I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm going to start maybe using some power windows, and look, you can see it's super interactive. I'll grab this power window, put something on that. Maybe I'll grab a qualifier over here. Shift H will let me view my qualifier. Again, I really like having the keyboard with this. I'm going to add some clean white, clean black, and blur just to make that take a little bit more GPU. Maybe I'll draw some curves there. So it's a relatively complex grade. Let's add a color space transform, and let's go to the timeline and apply an output transform to simulate color management. Back on the clip level, if I hit play, it's playing that grade in real time. Now, again, this is coming off of the local storage, which is really fast, but the fact that it's playing 1, 2, 3 color space transforms, a primary grade, film grain that's turned on, 3 power windows, and a qualifier with blur, that's pretty impressive. I mean, this is an iPad, remember. And just for fun, let's switch it over to UHD. And this is a cool little interface thing in the iPad. If you are using the pen or the mouse and you open up one of these big long drop downs like the timeline resolution, you can just use your finger to scroll through it really interactively and easy. That's a nice little touch. So I'm going to select UHD, hit save. Now we're processing this timeline at UHD. Hit play. Let's see where we're hitting. About 9-10 frames a second. Again, this is a pretty complicated node tree. If I turn off the film grain, I bet we get real time out of it. Yep, we get real time without the film grain. So heavy effects like film grain or some of the stylized effects or noise reduction, if I turn that on, you'll see the frames drop, but not as much as you would think. 7-8 frames a second for 4K temporal noise reduction is pretty good. And just like I mentioned in the beginning, under project settings, under general options, we can turn on user caching. And just like in the desktop, we can right click and turn on node caching. Then if I play the clip through and switch over to the timeline view from the thumbnail view, we get the familiar red and blue bar as it's caching. And once the cache is done, we now have real-time playback of our grade with the temporal noise reduction. So as you can see, Resolve for iPad is really full-featured and really powerful, especially because it does share the codebase with Desktop Resolve, allowing projects and timelines and databases to be completely interchangeable. And I think that's what is going to unlock this for some really cool new workflows. So first, let's talk about editing on the iPad on the cut page. One thing that's really cool is that the Speed Editor with Bluetooth is compatible with Resolve on the iPad. On the iPad, under Settings in Bluetooth, it just shows up as DaVinci Keyboard, and if I tap it and hit a few keys to wake up the Speed Editor, you see it pops up as connected. And then when I switch over to Resolve, the speed editor lights up. You can see the little jog shuttle selector is now lit, indicating Resolve is talking to the speed editor. And if I open up the source bin, I can start scrolling through clips, marking ins, marking outs, doing anything I could do on the cut page with the speed editor on the desktop version. And just like the color page, it's really interactive and fast. I can scroll through at high speed and it maintains a really good frame rate. So if I wanted to grab just a section of this, marking in, marking out, I'm just going to right click in my bin, create a new timeline, and just hit append. Now I have that clip in the timeline and I can navigate around it, split, trim in, trim out, all of your normal editorial things. Now this is going to be really useful if you need to edit on the road or on set, because basically what you can do is throw all your media onto an SSD, or even throw proxies or transcodes of your media onto an SSD and do what I think the cut page does best, which is rough out and edit really, really quickly. If I go back to the source tape view, I can just mark clips, append them to the timeline, just start kind of going through all of my media interactively and building a selects reel. And because the whole cut page is available on the iPad, the sync bin and multicam editing works. So I can open up the sync bin and sync my screen recording and my on-camera portion, just like I would in the desktop version of Resolve. And once it's analyzed the audio, I can save that sync. And because that sync bin interface is there, you can use this as an on-set tool or a remote tool to do things like syncing up all your rushes and preparing them for editorial. Because I'm working with this on the cloud database. So if I open up the project manager and right-click this project, I can turn on multi-user collaboration. And then I can open up that project on my desktop. And right now, the media is not linked, but I know I have copies of this media, so I'll just select Link Clips, locate the folder where they exist, and not only are the same files linked on my desktop computer, but if I go into Settings, Path Mapping, it's automatically put in the Apple iPad path and correlated it to my local path here. So now these two project paths are synced. If I added more media from one machine or from the iPad, it would be able to link to it automatically. And because we're on the desktop, I'm probably going to want to edit on the edit page. We can use the media sync that we created on the cut page using the sync bin, drop it into an edit page timeline, and look at that. It behaves just like a regular multicam clip. So with a speed editor and a little SSD and an iPad, you can have a remote logging, selects pulling, rough cutting, or even media syncing workstation that can go anywhere with you and behaves really fast and is just a joy to use. And for some projects, if you're shooting on a mobile phone, you might be in the field doing news or doing video blogging or something like that, you can just record on your phone, airdrop to your iPad, and edit finished pieces right in the cut page, and then just hit export and export to various formats. Now, this is an important difference between the iPad version and the desktop version. Not all formats are supported. Right now in the iPad version, you only get output to the formats that are available in Quick Export, which means you can't really go in and set your own export presets for it. You can export directly to YouTube, Vimeo, Twitter, or Dropbox if you sign into those services. And you can make H.264, H.265, and ProRes files locally on the iPad. When it comes to ingesting media, right now only H.264, H.265, and ProRes and Blackmagic RAW are supported. So if your media is something else, you can use the Blackmagic proxy generator or desktop Resolve to transcode your project to proxies, edit them on the cloud database with the proxies, and then link back to the full res on your main desktop workstation. In general, there's a lot of legal and technical issues related to format support, so it wouldn't surprise me if more formats made it in before this was finally released to the public, but right now those are the formats that are available. So yeah, it's a really powerful, fast mobile editor, but it's also very good with color, because color is obviously very core to what I do and what we do here at Mixing Light, and very core to DaVinci Resolve. So I've got some clips here, and I'm using the node-based ACES workflow that most of you are probably familiar with at this point. You can see I'm using the log.c IDT to bring this log.c footage into ACES. On the timeline level, I've got an ACES transform going from ACES CCT to Rec 709, and I've got my whole normal node tree here, and I can just use the pen or my finger to grade any of the normal fields. And I can go over to bars, and you can even tap in offset numbers with the up and down arrows. And for numeric fields, because you're on a touch interface, you can double click. You actually get this new little number generator. So I can punch in 20, hit enter, or I can double click and use the up and down arrow keys just like you can on desktop. You also get a handy little plus and minus in that calculator interface as well. So if you have a copy of your project and either proxy media or full res media, you can bring it with you on an SSD, and if a client needs a quick change or you need to adjust something, or if you're just on set or working remotely and you want to try out some looks, you have the full color tool set available to you. But as we know, color tools are not really useful if you don't have good color monitoring, and that's what makes Resolve for the iPad pretty unique in my opinion when it comes to color, because the viewer here, whether you're in a window or full screen, is fully color managed. And the new iPads on the latest iPad OS 16 have a reference mode that is very well calibrated to industry standards. These little iPad displays are shockingly accurate in both SDR and in HDR. So if I go into settings, display and brightness, and turn on reference mode, you'll notice we don't really get a lot of options here. We don't tell it what color space we're in, what we're doing. All of that is up to the software to control. So jumping back into DaVinci Resolve, not much has changed here, but that's because the viewer is driven by the output color space setting. And if we go into project settings, color management, right now I'm just set to a default DaVinci YRGB, Rec 709, Gamma 2.4. Now, if you haven't seen my insight on the new output color space option and what it does and why it's there, it's probably worth looking at. But for the sake of the iPad, the output color space is what defines your viewer color space. So right now I'm using a Rec 709 ODT on these clips. My viewer should be accurate to Rec 709. What about HDR? If I switch over to my timeline and change my output transform to P3D65, ST2084, 1000 nits, you'll notice we're still looking at this in SDR, and it looks kind of log and wrong. Switching back to the clip mode and jumping back into project settings, if I change my timeline color space to ACES CCT, which is going to define how the nodes behave, and change my output color space to match my output transform I built in my node tree, ST2084, 1000 nits, and hit save, the viewer has now instantly transformed to a color-accurate HDR viewer. And you can't really see it on the screen recording, but I'm looking at it now and it is in HDR. My scopes are already set to PQ. I can go all the way up to 1000 nits, and you can probably see in the reflection of my face that this display is putting out HDR brightness. And I think that is a huge use case for the iPad for colorists with DaVinci Resolve, because the iPad's display in HDR is a full array local dimming micro LED backlight. What this means is it doesn't suffer from any color volume issues, and it can be calibrated to be very, very accurate at higher brightness HDR. What does this mean? Well, I've talked at length about how you really shouldn't deliver HDR that you've only rendered on a WOLED consumer display, because the white pixel in those displays gives them really bad color volume issues, where the brighter you get, you start to get less and less saturated in really weird and non-linear ways. So what that really means is you could grade something in HDR on a consumer OLED display, and it could look absolutely beautiful, but you could have neon pink highlights and you would never know because your display can't show them. Now with Resolve for the iPad, you can just set up your viewer for HDR, open your same project with either proxy or copies of the full media, and look at it in HDR without any of those color volume issues. I think that's a really, really good feature for anybody trying to get into HDR that doesn't want to spend the big bucks on an HDR reference monitor and still wants to get quality monitoring and be able to do some HDR grading. I've always said that a really good HDR workflow with consumer OLEDs is to do the bulk of your grade on that display in your normal workflow, and then either rent a reference monitor or go to a facility that has one to do kind of a final check on your highlights and color volume issues and things like that that you wouldn't have been able to see on your OLED no matter how well calibrated it is. Well, now for $1,000 or $1,500, you can have that ability just with Resolve on an iPad. So I know this has been a really long one. I hope you stuck with me the whole time. But just to kind of wrap up, I really, really think Resolve for iPad is a great addition to the DaVinci Resolve family. The new iPad Pros are great pieces of hardware. They're very portable. They're very powerful. What's really cool about this also that I haven't talked about yet is battery life. I have been recording this insight for about an hour, maybe a little bit more than an hour. We're obviously going to cut it down in editing, but I've been working in Resolve on this iPad for over an hour, and at some points using HDR brightness and reference mode, I started at 100% battery, and I'm down to 85%. I've been on battery this whole time. This means a couple things. One, the battery life is pretty resilient for the amount of workload I was throwing at it. And two, the performance doesn't dramatically degrade when you're on battery versus plugged in, which is something that happens on a lot of laptops as they go into throttling for power management to save battery. Now, we'll be digging in deeper and testing more specific workflow things and editing and color grading on Resolve for the iPad as the beta evolves. But overall, I am super impressed. I can't wait to see where this goes, and I think it's a great addition to the tool set. As always, if you have any comments or questions, or if there's something specific you want me to test with Resolve on the iPad, let me know in the comments. For Mixing Light, I'm Joey D'Anna.